I never imagined that the quiet rhythm of my life could be disturbed by something so small, so ordinary. A favor, that's how it started. My husband suggested it casually over breakfast, between sips of his habitual black coffee, the same coffee he drank every morning without a hint of excitement. His words felt like background noise against the clink of his spoon against the cup. It would help him get on his feet, he said. He's good with his hands, could fix the fence, maybe. Take care of the garage door. I nodded. Of course, there was no reason not to. The young man he spoke of had been in our lives for years, his adoptive grandson, though never truly a child in my eyes, at least not anymore. He had grown. The last time I saw him, he was still caught somewhere between adolescence and adulthood. But now, stepping through our front door with that easy, careless smile, he carried himself like someone who knew exactly who he was. I noticed the change before I even registered it. His shoulders broader, his jawline sharper, a confidence in the way he moved that wasn't there before. The handshake was firm, the eye contact steady, but not invasive, friendly, familiar. And yet there was something else beneath it, an ease that felt a little too deliberate. My husband gave him a quick tour of the backyard, showing him the broken latch on the gate, the tools in the garage. Talking logistics in the way men do, practical, direct, uninterested in anything beyond the task. I stood at the kitchen window, watching them, my fingers absently tracing the rim of my coffee cup, feeling a strange, unplaceable tension knot itself somewhere between my ribs. It wasn't desire. Not yet. It was awareness. That evening, as I moved through the familiar routine of preparing dinner, I found myself choosing a dress I hadn't worn in months. Soft. Fabric, thin straps, the kind that clings just enough to remind you of your own body. I told myself it was because of the heat. Summer was pressing in against the windows, the air heavy, thick. But I knew better. The three of us ate together on the terrace. My husband spoke mostly about work, about the upcoming trip he'd need to take, another conference, another set of meetings, his words falling into the usual pattern of obligations and deadlines. I listened, nodded where appropriate, but my eyes drifted more than once toward the man sitting across from me. His posture relaxed, one arm draped casually over the back of his chair, the faintest trace of stubble along his jaw, like he hadn't bothered shaving that morning. His gaze caught mine only once, but it lingered just a second too long. When the meal was over, my husband excused himself to make a few calls. I stayed outside, gathering the plates, pretending not to notice the quiet footsteps behind me as the younger man approached. He reached for the stack of dishes in my hands. Let me help. Our fingers touched, just briefly in the exchange. A soft contact. Nothing intentional. Nothing anyone else would notice. But the sensation stayed with me, warm against my skin. Long after the plates were gone, later that night, lying in bed beside my husband, listening to the even sound of his breathing, I couldn't sleep. My body felt restless under the sheets, my thoughts noisy and uncooperative. I got up, moving barefoot through the darkened hallway toward the kitchen, telling myself I needed a glass of water. But it wasn't thirst that kept me awake. I paused by the guest room door. It was slightly ajar. From within, the faint sound of humming drifted out. A soft, careless tune, half sung under his breath as he moved around inside. I could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, the quiet rustle of clothes, the sound of the shower starting, water hitting tile. I stood there, frozen in place, listening. That ordinary private act, bathing, unwinding at the end of the day, felt suddenly intimate, invasive, as though I were witnessing something I shouldn't, but I didn't move. Not right away. When I finally forced myself back to bed, my body still ached with that same quiet tension. I slipped under the sheets beside my husband, felt the familiar weight of his arm resting loosely over my waist as he stirred in his sleep. His touch was gentle, habitual, unconscious, the way it had always been. But my mind was still standing outside that guest room door. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it would pass. I told myself I was imagining it, but something had already shifted. The next morning unfolded as predictably as any other. The sun poured through the half-open blinds, casting long stripes of light across the kitchen floor. I moved through the motions without thinking. The kettle on, the soft scrape of a butter knife against toast, the quiet hum of the refrigerator as I reached for the milk. My husband had already left, early as usual, a brief kiss on my cheek. Before the front door clicked shut behind him, routine, safe, expected. I told myself to stop, to quiet whatever had stirred inside me the night before. I told myself that I was too old for such nonsense, too wise to let my imagination roam so freely. But my body betrayed me in small ways. The choice of my dress again that morning, the subtle attention I gave to my appearance as I tied my hair back, a touch of color on my lips. Not for anyone, of course, just for the sake of feeling something. I found him outside, already at work on the fence, sleeves rolled up, arms taut as he hammered the rusted nails back into place. His focus was complete, absorbed in the task, unaware, or perhaps deliberately appearing unaware, of my presence. As I stood for a moment watching him from the porch, the sweat along the line of his brow caught the morning light, glinting like tiny beads of glass against his skin. His body moved with the ease of someone comfortable in physical labor, each motion efficient, unhurried. I stepped down toward the garden, carrying the laundry basket with the kind of purposeful grace I'd perfected over the years, if he noticed. The way my dress swayed around my legs, the thin strap slipping from my shoulder. He gave no indication, but then, as I reached to clip the first piece of fabric onto the line, I felt his gaze, not accidental, not passing. It settled on me, steady and unapologetic, like hands pressing lightly against my back. I didn't turn right away. I kept my eyes on the clothespins, feeling my pulse rise beneath my skin. When I finally looked toward him, his expression was unreadable, lips slightly parted as if on the edge of saying something. "Morning's warmer than I expected," he said at last, his voice smooth, low. I gave a small nod, pretending to focus on my task. "It is. It could have ended there. It should have ended there." But he didn't go back to work. He walked toward me, slow, measured steps across the trimmed lawn, stopping close enough that I could feel the faint heat of his body. "In the space between us, you look different today," he said. I didn't reply. I couldn't trust my voice. Instead, I reached for another pin, carefully fixing the next piece of fabric onto the line, my hands steady even as my heart raced beneath my ribs. There was a pause, just long enough for the moment to hover between us, uncertain. "I'm sorry about last night," he said then, softer, almost hesitant. If I crossed a line, I could have stopped it there. I could have taken the offer out, smiled politely, assured him that nothing had happened. Nothing at all. But instead I found myself holding his gaze, too long, too deliberately. "You didn't," I answered. The words left my lips before I had the chance to weigh them. He stepped closer, so close now that I could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied my face. His hand moved, hesitant at first, toward the curve of my arm, fingers brushing lightly along the bare skin of my shoulder. I didn't move away. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, the air between us thick with the weight of everything unspoken. And then, as if the space could no longer hold the tension, he leaned in, closing the distance between us in one steady, certain motion. The kiss was nothing like I expected. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't rough. It was soft, searching, the gentle pressure of lips against lips, asking, not taking. His hand lifted to my jaw, thumb grazing my cheek as he tilted my face toward him. My body froze for a second, my mind screaming warnings, but my lips parted. Anyway, meeting his in a slow, trembling reply. The basket slipped from my fingers, the soft thud of it hitting the ground, barely registering through the blood pounding in my ears. I felt the heat of his palm sliding along the line of my neck, fingers brushing the edge where my dress clung to my skin. I pulled back first, breath catching in my throat, eyes wide. "This can't," I managed, the words thick, clumsy. He didn't argue. He stepped back, giving me space, his hands raised as if in surrender, but his eyes stayed on me, unwavering. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's not going to stop us from wanting it." I turned away before he could see the flush rising to my cheeks, bending down to gather the scattered laundry with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. The rest of the day blurred into routine again, watering the plants, wiping down the Counters, answering my husband's call when he checked in about dinner plans. I kept my voice steady, kept my smile intact, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the ghost of his mouth against mine. I couldn't shake it. The taste of that morning's kiss lingered like a secret trapped beneath my skin. Impossible to ignore, no matter how hard I pressed it down with chores, calls, polite conversations, daily duties that should have filled the space in my mind. But they didn't. They barely scratched the surface. Everything inside me felt unsettled, my body too aware of itself, my thoughts circling the same forbidden orbit over and over. He acted as though nothing had happened, or at least, he pretended well enough. When we crossed paths in the house, passing in the hallway, brushing shoulders near the sink, his expression was always composed, unreadable, maddeningly calm, and yet I caught him watching me sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, gaze lingering a second too long before turning away. There was no apology in it, no shame, only that same quiet, steady insistence. It made me reckless, or maybe just honest. The next night, my husband announced he'd be leaving early in the morning. Another sudden trip for work. 3 days, maybe 4. His voice was apologetic, but his eyes stayed glued to his phone as he spoke, tapping out messages between bites. Of dinner, I smiled, nodded, said the right things. Of course it's important, don't worry, I'll manage here. And I meant it. At least part of me did, but another part burned. That night I stood longer than necessary in front of the bathroom mirror, tracing the curve of my own collarbone with curious fingers, noticing the way my skin flushed beneath my own touch. I chose my nightgown with too much care, softer fabric, something that felt like temptation, even if no one else would see it. The woman in the reflection looked back at me like a stranger, a woman I hadn't been in a long time. I didn't sleep. My body lay still under the sheets, my breathing measured, listening as my husband turned, shifted, finally settled into the steady rhythm of deep sleep beside me. When I couldn't stand it any longer, I slid from the bed, bare feet silent against the hardwood floor as I crept down the hallway, out onto the terrace, where the night air pressed cool against my flushed skin. He was already there, leaning back against the railing, arms folded, his profile half lit by the pale wash of the moon. I wondered if he had been waiting, or if the same restlessness had pulled him from his bed as it had mine. When he heard the soft click of the door behind me, he turned his head, eyes finding me easily in the dark. Neither of us spoke. I stood there, gripping the edge of the doorframe like it might hold me steady against the weight of the moment. His gaze dropped, tracing the line of my body, the thin fabric of my nightgown doing little to conceal the shape beneath it. I should have felt ashamed. I should have stepped back inside, locked the door, buried myself beneath the covers and prayed for morning. Instead, I stepped closer. The distance between us closed too quickly, our bodies drawn forward by something neither of us seemed able to resist. He reached for me, fingers brushing my wrist. Light as a question, I didn't pull away. My hand lifted on its own, resting against the line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of his stubble beneath my palm, the heat of his skin humming beneath the surface. I shouldn't be here, I whispered. His reply came low, steady. But you are. The way he looked at me, not like a boy chasing a fantasy, but like a man who knew exactly what he wanted, made something deep inside me twist, ache. His hand moved to the small of my back, pulling me in slowly, giving me time to stop him. I didn't. My body leaned into his, as though it belonged. There, my head tipping back, lips parting before his even touched mine. When the kiss came, it was softer this time, slower, deliberate. A question asked, not with words, but with the patient press of lips against lips, the slide of his hand along the curve of my waist. He kissed me like he wanted to memorize it. Each second counted, held, and I let him. I kissed him back with the same quiet hunger, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Holding him close, the night around us stood still, the air thick with heat and the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden below. Somewhere inside the house, the clock ticked steadily on, indifferent to the storm building between our bodies. When I finally broke away, breathless, my hands still resting against his chest, he didn't move to pull me back. He let me go, but his eyes never left mine. "I'm not sorry," he said softly. I didn't answer. I turned away, stepping back through the door, closing it behind me with hands that trembled as though they no longer belonged to me. The next morning, everything returned to its ordinary shape. The kitchen filled again with the sounds of running water, the clink of dishes, the low hum of the radio. My husband's suitcase sat packed by the front door, ready for his early departure. He kissed my cheek on the way out, the gesture familiar, practiced, safe. But my body still remembered the night. Every nerve awake beneath my skin, every inch of me alive with the echo of his mouth on mine. And I knew then that this wouldn't be the end. It was only the beginning, the morning after. The world wore its usual mask of normalcy so well that for a moment I almost believed it myself. The sky was impossibly clear, the sun bright but forgiving, the breeze gentle through the open windows as if it too wanted to lull me back into the illusion of simplicity. The coffee steamed in its cup, the toast browned just right, the daily rituals playing their parts like a well-rehearsed play. I sat at the kitchen table longer than necessary, my fingers tracing slow circles around the rim of my mug. The chair across from me was empty, the air in the room still thick with the weight of what had happened the night before. My body carried it like a hidden mark beneath the skin. That kiss, that closeness, the soft, deliberate press of his mouth against mine, the ache it left behind. I told myself again that it had to stop, that I could pull myself back, that I hadn't crossed a line I couldn't return from. But my body betrayed me with every thought of him, the memory of his hand along my waist, the certainty in his voice when he said he wasn't sorry. I should have been angry. I should have been disgusted with myself. But there was only the steady thrum of wanting, pulsing low and deep, as if my body had finally remembered how to feel. When I heard the soft creak of the back door, the quiet footsteps crossing the kitchen floor, I didn't lift my head right away. I knew it was him before he spoke. His presence filled the space even when he said nothing. "I'm heading out to pick up some materials." His voice broke the silence, casual, easy. "Need anything from town?" I shook my head, eyes fixed on the swirling patterns of my coffee. "No, I'm fine." It was a lie so thin I couldn't even hear the words without feeling them crack. But he didn't challenge it. He left as quietly as he came, the door closing softly behind him, the weight of his absence almost as heavy as his nearness. I spent the next few hours trying to reclaim myself, folding laundry with unnecessary precision, wiping down already clean countertops, rearranging the books on the shelf simply to give my hands something to do. But nothing dulled the sharp edges of the tension humming beneath my skin. Every motion felt like a poor imitation of normal life, a performance I no longer believed in. By late afternoon, the weight of the silence in the house was too much to bear. I told myself I needed to get out, just for a while, clear my head, reset. I grabbed my keys, threw on a light jacket despite the warmth of the day, and drove toward the town center, eyes on the road, thoughts everywhere else. The streets were familiar, predictable, the same small grocery store where I'd shopped for years, the same sleepy cafe on the corner where couples sat sipping coffee in comfortable silence. I wandered the aisles without purpose, letting my fingers glide across the shelves as if the act of choosing between brands of cereal could somehow anchor me back to reality. And then I saw him. I turned the corner near the produce section, and there he was, standing at the far end of the aisle, one hand resting on the handle of a shopping cart, his head tilted slightly as he read the label on a jar. He looked up, caught my eye, and for a moment neither of us moved. It was too much of a coincidence, too deliberate. My stomach tightened, my breath catching somewhere between my chest and throat. He offered a half smile, easy, unbothered. "Didn't expect to see you here." I swallowed hard, tried to match his casual tone. Same. The space between us felt impossibly small despite the width of the aisle. We both stood there, silent, each of us pretending not to notice the electricity sparking between the words we didn't say. "Need a hand carrying things?" he asked after a pause, gesturing toward my empty basket, the faintest glint of amusement in his eyes. "I'm fine," I replied, voice flatter than I intended, but I didn't walk away. Instead, we moved down the next aisle together, side by side, making small talk about nothing: the weather, the price of fresh herbs, the absurdity of the parking situation outside. His hand brushed mine once as we reached for the same box of tea. Neither of us apologized. The drive home was quiet, the car filled with the low hum of the engine and the unbearable tension of proximity. I could feel his gaze on me now and then as I stared out the window, trying to pretend that my pulse wasn't hammering hard against my ribs. When we reached the house, he killed the engine but didn't move to open the door. Instead, he turned toward me, leaning back slightly in his seat. "I didn't plan to run into you," he said softly, "but I'm glad I did." I looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time I saw it, the same battle raging behind his eyes that I felt burning inside me. The wanting, the restraint, the quiet, painful awareness of what we were doing. "This is dangerous," I said, the words barely a whisper. His gaze held mine, unwavering. "I know." The moment stretched between us, too long, too full, and then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out, his fingers brushing the inside of my wrist, light as breath, as if testing whether I would pull away. I didn't. He leaned closer, his eyes searching mine, waiting, giving me the choice, and once again, I didn't stop him. His lips touched mine gently at first, careful, tasting, like the first sip of something forbidden. But the hesitation didn't last. The kiss deepened, slow but certain, his hand cradling the back of my neck as my body melted into the gravity of his. When we finally broke apart, breathless, I pressed my forehead against his, eyes closed, my heart pounding so hard it almost hurt. "We shouldn't," I said. "But we will," he replied, and we both knew he was right. There was no avoiding it after that. No more space for excuses, no more thin walls of denial to hide behind. Something between us had been set into motion, and neither of us made any serious effort to stop it. If anything, the acknowledgement of it, that shared honesty, seemed to ignite the desire further, stripping away the last layers of hesitation that had kept us pretending. My husband left early the next morning, suitcase in hand, the familiar sound of the front door closing behind him, like the soft click of a trigger being pulled. The silence he left behind felt heavier than usual, the kind of quiet that amplifies every small noise, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet, the distant chirp of birds outside the window. Ordinary sounds, unbearably loud. I stood at the kitchen counter, my hands wrapped around a coffee cup I hadn't touched, my eyes fixed on the thin line of steam curling upward as if I could lose myself there long enough to forget the weight pressing down on my chest. But I couldn't. My body was awake in ways it hadn't been in years. Restless, sensitive, aching beneath the surface when I heard the faint knock at the back door. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even need to look. I felt him there before I saw him. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door softly behind him. His eyes found me instantly, reading the conflict I hadn't managed to hide. I could feel the heat rising beneath my skin as he approached, the space between us disappearing in just a few steps. Neither of us spoke. His hand lifted, fingers grazing the side of my face, moving back into my hair as he watched me carefully. There was no aggression in his touch, only certainty. His thumb traced lightly along my jaw, a gentle pressure that felt both patient and possessive all at once. The kiss came quickly this time, without the slow, cautious build of the ones before. His mouth found mine with a hunger that matched my own, his hands sliding down to my waist, pulling me into him, as though we'd already spent years denying this. And maybe we had, maybe not directly, but in every small moment we'd looked past each other, pretended not to feel what was already there. I don't remember reaching for him, but my hands were in his hair, my fingers tightening as I leaned into the kiss, tasting the mix of urgency and restraint that made it impossible to stop. My heart pounded so hard, I thought he must be able to feel it through my chest. He pressed me gently against the kitchen counter, one hand steady at the small of my back, the other resting on my hip, holding me there as though I might disappear if he let go. I didn't resist. My body leaned into his, eager, trembling, desperate. For the warmth of him, the weight of his hands, the pull of his mouth against mine. It wasn't rough, it wasn't careless, Every touch was deliberate, every movement slow enough to make me ache, fast enough to set my skin on fire. When his lips left my mouth and trailed down the line of my throat, I gasped, my head tipping back instinctively, my fingers still tangled in his hair. His breath was hot against my skin, his mouth soft but insistent as he kissed along the delicate curve of my neck. "I can't stop," he murmured against my skin, his voice ragged, low. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind had gone quiet, my body speaking a language I hadn't allowed myself to hear in far too long. It wasn't the first time my husband had left me alone in this house. It wasn't the first time I'd felt the weight of loneliness pressing into the spaces he didn't fill. But this was the first time I'd let someone else reach into that emptiness and claim it. The world outside remained unchanged. The garden swayed gently in the breeze, the hum of traffic a faint whisper beyond the hedges, the sky wide and cloudless above it all. Indifferent, but inside, everything felt different. Alive, dangerous, when he finally stepped back, his chest rising and falling hard, his hands still resting at my waist. His eyes stayed locked on mine. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The air between us charged, heavy with the choice we'd already made. "You know this isn't going to be enough," he said finally, his voice steady. I nodded slowly, my fingers brushing the edge of the countertop as if I needed something solid to keep me grounded. He was right. A kiss, a stolen moment in the kitchen. It would never be enough. The wanting had taken root too deep. As he turned to leave, I watched the curve of his back, the way his shoulders squared, as though bracing himself against the gravity of what we'd just done. But he didn't look back. I stood there long after the door closed behind him, my body humming with the echo of his touch, my lips still swollen from the weight of his mouth against mine. I should have felt regret, but all I felt was the unbearable hunger. For the next time, I woke the next morning with the taste of him still, lingering somewhere between my lips and memory, like a bruise you can't see but feel with every breath. The sunlight spilled across the bedroom floor in soft lines, casting familiar patterns against the wall. But the room itself felt altered, as though it now held some secret I couldn't pack away neatly between folded sheets and half-empty drawers. There was no use pretending, not to myself, not anymore. The line had been crossed, not in some accidental stumble, but with full, open eyes. And what scared me most wasn't the guilt I was supposed to feel, but the hunger that grew sharper. Each time I replayed his hands on my skin, his breath warm against my neck, the roughness of his stubble brushing my jaw as his lips searched for more. I moved through the house slowly that morning, touching the furniture as though it belonged to someone else, the kitchen counter where my back had arched against his grip, the chair he'd sat in the night before, calm as water, as though we hadn't unraveled ourselves in the soft light of early morning. Every corner of the house felt marked, even if there were no visible signs. It was as if the walls had absorbed the heat of it all and now radiated it back at me. I busied my hands with cleaning moving objects that didn't need to be moved, wiping surfaces already spotless. Each motion was mechanical, a poor attempt to mute the tension rising steadily beneath my ribs. But no amount of distraction could silence it. Every touch of my own hands against my body, folding clothes, brushing hair back from my face, seemed to awaken the places where his fingers had been. By midday, the house was too still, the silence so loud it pressed against my ears. I knew I wouldn't last the afternoon pacing between walls that only reminded me of him. I told myself I needed air, needed to get out, even if only for an hour. The decision felt innocent enough as I grabbed my keys, pulling a sweater loosely over my shoulders, slipping on the pair of flats I kept by the door. But the second I stepped outside, my heart quickened with the quiet possibility of running into him again. That dangerous game of chance that had already ceased to feel accidental. I drove aimlessly at first, the soft hum of the engine filling the quiet. The streets of the town blurred past in familiar shapes. But my mind wandered elsewhere, to the weight of his gaze, the certainty in his hands, the sound of his breath. Thick with need as he pressed against me, I felt the pulse of it low in my belly, a craving I could neither name nor satisfy on my own without fully deciding to. I found myself pulling into the parking lot of the small convenience store on the edge of town. The place where I knew he sometimes stopped, where the roads crossed just often enough that a meeting there could still pass for coincidence, I told. Myself, I was just buying milk, bread, maybe, a mindless errand. But my eyes scanned the lot before I even cut the engine, searching for the shape of his car. It wasn't there. I should have felt relief. But all I felt was the heavy ache of disappointment. Inside, I wandered the narrow aisles slowly, barely noticing what my hands picked up, my body operating separately from my thoughts. I turned down the next aisle, and there he was. Not at the counter, not outside, but standing in front of the cooler. One hand braced against the metal door, the other casually tucked into his back pocket. His head turned at the sound of my footsteps, eyes locking onto mine with the ease of someone who had been waiting, or hoping, I couldn't tell which. For a moment neither of us moved. I reached for the carton of milk nearest my hand, my fingers too steady for how fast my heart was racing. His gaze followed the motion, slow, deliberate. "You following me now?" His voice was soft, teasing. I gave a short shake of my head, the corners of my mouth lifting before I could stop them. Not intentionally. The space between us felt suffocating, even with the cool air from the open fridge brushing against my skin. I turned my body slightly away, pretending to study the labels of the drinks in front of me, but I felt the heat of his eyes, felt it settle against the curve of my back like a hand pressing down. "You're not wearing your ring," he said, quieter now. I froze for half a second before glancing down at my hand, bare as it had been that morning when I'd slipped it off without thinking, placing it gently into the dish beside the sink where I usually kept it at night. I didn't answer. The silence between us thickened, heavy with the words neither of us was willing to say aloud, but they hung there anyway, undeniable. He stepped closer, his movement casual but certain, closing the distance just enough that I could smell the faint trace of his cologne beneath the clean scent of soap. My body tensed, my breath catching in my throat. "Do you want me to stop?" His question hovered there, soft but steady. I could have said yes, should have, but my lips parted and nothing came. Instead, I felt the weight of his hand brushing lightly against the small of my back, fingers trailing upward until they reached the edge of my shoulder. His thumb moved slowly, tracing the line of my sweater, his eyes locked on mine, waiting for any sign of protest. There was none. When I finally exhaled, it came out shaky, uneven, my body leaning just slightly toward his touch like a moth drawn helplessly to the flame. We didn't kiss, not there, not in the open where anyone could see, but the tension between us wrapped tight, pulling our bodies forward in a silent agreement that neither of us dared put into words. The drive home felt endless. Every stoplight, every turn, another reminder of the choice I hadn't made, or perhaps the one I'd already made long before I was willing to admit it. I spent the rest of the evening pacing between rooms, restless, unable to settle. My body craved the heat of his hands, the firmness of his grip, the weight of his mouth against mine. But more than that, I craved the way he looked at me, as though I were still alive beneath the surface of habit and compromise when the message finally came, short and direct. "Are you alone?" I didn't hesitate before typing back the only word that felt true. Yes, and even before he knocked, I was already waiting. The knock at the door was soft, almost polite, as though the weight of what waited on the other side might be lessened by its gentleness. But it wasn't. My hands trembled against the smooth wood as I reached for the handle, fingers curling tightly around it, willing myself to breathe evenly. I knew who it was. I had known the moment my phone vibrated. Against the kitchen counter, the single line of text glowing in the half-dark, like an invitation I was already too deep inside to refuse. When I opened the door, he stood there, one hand tucked into the pocket of his jeans, the other resting against the frame, leaning slightly, gaze steady. He didn't smile. He didn't have to. The space between us was so charged, it felt like standing too close to a live wire, the air thick with anticipation, humming beneath the skin. I stepped aside without a word, letting him cross the threshold. His eyes moved over me slowly, pausing at the loose knot of my hair, the thin straps of the top I had chosen so carelessly but so deliberately. My body responded before my mind could catch up. The faint tightening low in my belly, the warmth blooming across my chest as though my skin itself remembered the feel of his hands, I closed the door quietly behind him. Neither of us spoke. The seconds stretched, long and unbearable, until he moved toward me, closing the space with steady, measured steps. His hand reached out, fingers brushing the line of my collarbone, trailing upward to the curve of my neck. I tilted my head back slightly, involuntarily, the sensation of his touch igniting something I could no longer smother beneath reason. "I shouldn't be here," he said at last, voice low. But his hand didn't leave me. "I know," I answered, and then I stepped forward, closing the gap that had been nothing but an illusion, my body pressing into his as if drawn by gravity. His mouth found mine with a hunger that felt both familiar and desperate, lips firm, fingers threading into my hair as he deepened the kiss. There was no hesitation this time, no careful pacing, only need. The kiss was different now, bolder, heavier, carrying the weight of every moment we had held back, every glance that had lingered too long, every breath we had stolen in the spaces where we pretended to be innocent. His hands moved down my back, pulling me closer, holding me as though afraid I might vanish if he let go. I felt myself lean into him, my body softening against his, surrendering to the pull I had fought so uselessly. The warmth of his breath against my cheek, the solid line of his chest against mine, the slow, deliberate slide of his palm along my waist. All of it unraveled me, piece by piece. When he finally broke the kiss, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths shallow, tangled. "This doesn't feel wrong," he whispered, and I hated how much I agreed. We stood there like that, suspended in the quiet of the house, the only sound our unsteady breathing, the soft tick of the clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds we could no longer pretend didn't exist. "I can't stop wanting you," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly at the edge. My hand lifted, fingers grazing the side of his face, tracing the curve of his jaw. My lips parted, but the words felt too heavy to form. What could I say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? What explanation could make sense of this hunger that had taken root so deep inside me? The truth was, I didn't want to stop either. I had spent so many years pretending that wanting had an expiration date, that marriage meant the end of that particular ache, the quiet burn beneath the skin. But here it was, alive and sharp, reminding me with every touch that I was still capable of desire. Not the polite, measured affection I had come to accept, but raw, urgent, undeniable. We moved toward the living room, almost without thinking, hands never leaving each other, bodies drawn forward by the magnetic pull of everything we weren't saying. The couch offered no resistance as I sank back onto it, pulling him with me, his weight pressing me into the cushions, his mouth finding the soft space beneath my ear. His fingers traced the edge of my shoulder, slipping the strap of my top down slowly, carefully, as though unwrapping something delicate, dangerous. My skin shivered beneath his touch, my body arching into him, craving more, but then, just as the heat between us threatened to spill over into something unstoppable, he paused, pulling back just enough to meet my eyes. "Tell me to go," he whispered. I stared at him, my chest rising and falling fast beneath the thin fabric, my lips swollen from the weight of his kiss. My heart thundered against my ribs, the war between guilt and wanting tearing me in two. But I couldn't say the words. Instead, my hand lifted. Again, fingers curling around the front of his shirt, pulling him back down to me, my mouth finding his with all the certainty I couldn't put into speech. The night closed in around us, the walls of the house silent witnesses to the choice we made over and over again without saying it out loud. There was no plan, no future spoken between us, only the unbearable need of the present moment, the way his body felt against mine, the taste of him on my tongue, the heat of his hands exploring the skin I had almost forgotten, could feel this alive. And when he finally left, long after the moon had climbed high above the rooftops, the weight of his absence pressed into the room as sharply as his presence had. I lay awake for hours, the sheets tangled around my legs, my body still trembling. With the memory of his touch, the guilt I thought I'd feel never came. Only the unbearable ache of knowing I would let it happen again, because the truth was simple. I didn't want it to stop. I wish I could say that after that night, reason caught up with me. That the weight of what I had done crushed me beneath guilt. that the shame wrapped itself so tightly around my throat I had no choice but to confess, or run, or fight against the wanting. But that's not what happened. What happened was worse, maybe. What happened was hunger. Desire has its own logic, its own timing, its own rules. Once it takes hold of you, once it finds where you're weakest, it doesn't let go. It doesn't care about rings on fingers or years spent sharing a table and a bed. It doesn't ask for permission. It just waits, patient, certain, hungry. I went through the next days performing the ordinary with so much effort it exhausted me. I smiled when I was supposed to, answered phone calls, replied to messages from my husband as though my hands weren't still burning with the memory of someone else's touch. His voice over the phone was kind, familiar, full of the same soft attention I had known for years. He told me about the meetings, about the colleagues, about the dinner he'd been invited to and couldn't refuse. His words painted the usual picture of our life, safe, predictable, intact. I answered as I always did, my voice steady, my replies automatic. But beneath the surface, something inside me kept pulling at the threads of that neat little fabric. Unraveling it slowly, silently, the house felt emptier now, even though it had always been this quiet when he was away. But I had changed. Or maybe I had simply admitted something I had buried for too long. I started noticing myself again. The way I chose my clothes each morning, how my hands lingered on the silk of certain blouses, the lace of underthings I hadn't worn in months, not for my husband, not even for the man I should never have touched, but for the version of myself I thought had disappeared, the woman who still wanted to feel desirable, to feel awake. When I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, I didn't look away as quickly as I used to. I let my eyes trace the soft lines time had drawn across my face, the curve of my lips, the bare skin of my shoulders. I stood there longer than necessary, adjusting the neckline of my dress, watching the way the fabric clung to the shape beneath. The days blurred into one another, marked by small tasks and the heavy, dragging ache of waiting. Every sound outside the window sent my heart leaping, every creak of the floorboards tightening something low in my stomach. I didn't know if he would come again. I didn't ask, but when the soft knock came at the back door, I wasn't surprised. I opened it without hesitation. He stood there, not leaning casually this time, not hiding behind any practiced calm. His hands were in his pockets, his gaze direct, unflinching. "I shouldn't be here," he said again. I could have answered with the same words, repeated the same warnings. We both knew meant nothing, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside. He moved past me slowly, as if measuring each step, as if waiting for me to change my mind, to close the door behind him and end whatever this was before it grew into something we couldn't control. But I didn't close the door. I followed him into the kitchen where the air felt heavier, thicker, the charged silence wrapping itself around us like a second skin. I leaned back against the counter, my arms crossed loosely in front of me, watching him as he hovered there, unsure of how close he could get this time, unsure if I would let him. He stayed still for a moment, searching my face for something I wasn't sure how to give. A sign, a permission, an invitation. I gave him nothing, only the quiet curve of my body leaning back, my lips parted just enough to let the breath slip out slow and steady, the way my eyes stayed locked on his. It was enough. He crossed the space between us, his hand lifting, fingers brushing lightly against my cheek before sliding back into my hair, gripping it just tight enough to pull my face toward his. The kiss came hard, fast, his lips crashing into mine with the weight of every hour spent waiting. I tasted the urgency on his tongue, felt the hunger in the way his body pressed against mine, pinning me between the hard edge of the counter and the solid line of his chest. I gave in easily, completely. My hands moved to his shoulders, fingers, curling into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, needing more. There was no careful pacing this time, no soft, tentative touches, only the raw ache of two people who knew they shouldn't, and did anyway. His mouth trailed down my neck, teeth grazing lightly along the sensitive skin beneath my ear, making me gasp, my body arching instinctively into his. His hands found the small of my back, slid beneath the hem of my blouse, warm and firm against my skin. We moved from the kitchen to the living room without words, our bodies tangled together, hands roaming freely now, lips never breaking apart for more than a breath. The couch caught us again, my back against the cushions, his weight pressing into me, grounding me in the key moment, stripping away whatever was left of my hesitation. But then he paused, pulled back just enough to look down at me, his breath heavy, eyes searching. "We're not going to stop, are we?" His voice was rough, thick with the fight between restraint and desire. I didn't answer. I reached up, my fingers brushing across his jaw, pulling him back down to me, my mouth finding his again. The truth didn't need words. We were past the point of pretending, and as the night folded itself around us, as his hands memorized the shape of me, I stopped asking myself whether this was right or wrong. I already knew it was inevitable. By the time my husband returned, the house had already learned how to keep my secret. The walls held the silence as if nothing had happened within them, as if they hadn't witnessed the slow, deliberate tearing apart of the life I had so carefully built. The kitchen was clean, the bed made, the laundry folded and tucked neatly away in drawers. My hands moved through the routines with mechanical precision, my body performing the gestures of a woman whose life was still in order, but I was not in order. There are certain betrayals that don't make noise, no slammed doors, no raised voices, no objects thrown across the room in anger. Some betrayals happen so quietly that they slip beneath the surface like a slow leak, unnoticed at first, until one day you realize the floor beneath you is rotting away. I thought I would feel it. The weight of shame, the crushing guilt that's supposed to follow you like a shadow, but guilt, I discovered, is not always loud. Sometimes it wears the face of longing. Sometimes it tastes like the mouth of the person you should never have kissed. He kept his distance for 2 days after that last night. I didn't see him. I didn't hear the knock at the back door, but I felt him everywhere in the way I caught myself staring out the kitchen window longer than necessary, waiting for a shadow to move past, in the way my skin still burned beneath the places where his hands had held me, fingers tracing paths that hadn't yet faded from memory. When my husband walked through the door, suitcase in hand, his smile was the same soft curve I had seen 100 times before, familiar, kind, safe. He kissed me on the cheek, his lips warm but absent of hunger, and asked about the house, about the garden, about the little details that had always filled the space between us. I answered as I always did, my voice even, my smile polite. But there was a part of me standing outside myself, watching the scene like a stranger, watching the woman who had once been so certain of the lines she would never cross, now nodding, along as though she hadn't already burned those lines to ash. At dinner, I listened as he told me about the conference, about the colleagues, about the deals that had gone well and the ones that hadn't. His words filled the air between bites of roasted chicken and sips of wine. The same wine he always picked, dry, reliable, familiar. Like him, I smiled where I was supposed to. I laughed at the right moments. I touched his hand across the table, the gesture smooth, practiced, effortless. But inside, my thoughts wandered elsewhere, to stronger hands, to a mouth that kissed like it meant it. That night, when we moved together in the quiet of our shared bed, his touch was gentle, patient, the way it had always been. But my body did not answer him. I lay beneath him with my eyes closed, my hands resting loosely at his sides, my mind miles away, my skin waiting for a spark that did not come. I knew how to play the part. I knew how to make the right sounds, how to arch my back just enough, how to finish the performance without breaking character. But the truth was, I felt nothing, or worse, I felt the memory of someone else. When it was over, he kissed my shoulder softly, whispered that he had missed me. I closed my eyes tighter, swallowing the ache that rose in my throat. I wondered if he could feel it, the absence beneath my skin where love had once lived. The next morning, I moved through the motions again. Breakfast, dishes, the list of errands I told myself needed to be done. I watched him leave for the office, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side, his back straight, shoulders squared, trusting. And as soon as the door closed behind him, I felt the weight of my own breath catch in my chest. I don't know if I had been waiting for the message, or if part of me had already written it in my head before the words even reached my phone. "Are you free?" The answer was already there, waiting beneath my fingertips before I had time to argue with myself. Come. The knock at the back door came faster than I expected, as though he hadn't been far, as though he knew the space I had left open. For him, the door inside me that I hadn't locked, when I let him in, there were no words between us. Only the steady pull of bodies that had already chosen each other long before permission had been given. His hands found me easily, as though they remembered the shape of me by instinct alone. My body answered him before my mind could intervene. But this time, something was different. This time, when he held my face between his palms, when his lips pressed against mine with that same aching need, there was no rush, no frantic tearing away of clothes, no desperate hands pulling and grabbing. There was patience, there was care, and that somehow made it worse, because it felt like something more. I felt it in the way his fingers lingered at the edge of my jaw, tracing the line slowly, as though memorizing it. I felt it in the softness of his mouth against my throat, the weight of his body pressing into mine without urgency, as though we had all the time in the world, and I hated it, because wanting him was one thing, needing him was another. But this tenderness, this dangerous sweetness, this felt like the beginning of something neither of us had the right to claim. When we were finished, when we lay tangled together in the soft aftermath of it, his hand rested lightly against my hip, his thumb moving in slow, absent circles against my skin. "We can't keep doing this," I said at last, my voice barely, louder than a breath. He didn't argue. He didn't offer promises or excuses. He only nodded, eyes closed, his forehead resting against my shoulder. But neither of us moved, neither of us got up. And in the stillness of that moment, I understood. What terrified me most, it wasn't the guilt. It was the fact that I no longer wanted to stop,